Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sesotris, and this week I wanted to talk about media literacy, literary criticism, and answering the age-old question, are the curtains just blue? Literary analysis is one of those things that just hounds students forever, and there's a lot of angst surrounding it, and I feel like it's because mostly literary criticism just isn't taught very well, especially at like the high school level. And we're seeing kind of a lack of media literacy among adults now, and I feel like that came from when those adults were in high school and they weren't really given the correct tools in order to navigate things like literary criticism, analyzing things, and that translates to things like analyzing movies and analyzing TV shows. And so I wanted to talk about what literary criticism really is and what it isn't, because there's a lot of confusing stuff surrounding it, especially in the way that certain teachers teach it. And this isn't really a dig at teachers, it's more a dig at underfunded schools who give teachers massive classrooms and not a lot of time to prepare for the classrooms, and so a lot of times they'll just go to shorthand and they won't have time to really explain the concepts that they're trying to teach because they have to kind of rush through a really big curriculum. So I'm not blaming teachers here. Teachers are amazing, but I do think students aren't getting the best version of learning what literary criticism is as things are now. I've talked about literary criticism before, but I recently saw a really great TikTok that was talking about the same kind of subject, and it just got me thinking. I really liked the way that the person talked about the way that media literacy is changing kind of the way that we interact with movies. She talks about this concept called corn plating, which is sort of a derogatory term used to criticize someone who is sort of overthinking symbolism in a piece of media. In this case, they were looking at, there's a scene in Encanto where there's a character holding a plate of corn, and the person says, I just noticed she's holding a plate of corn. And anyways, it's a whole discussion, and I'm sure if you look that up, you can find it on TikTok. But this concept of like, you're reading too much into it, or it's just a story, why do we have to dig that deep into something, that's thrown at teachers a lot in high school and even college. When I was teaching literature, the responses that I would get a lot of times were, what's the point of learning this, like what value does this skill have? And like, valid, it's not a super marketable skill, but it is a skill that helps you interact with media in interesting ways, and it's really difficult to teach without spending a whole lot of boring time talking about why, and a lot of time there isn't room for that. And so it's a whole big thing. But I think one of the things that happens is a lot of times teachers will present like an analysis or a reading of a book as sort of the only way you can interpret it. It's sort of like, this is what the symbolism is for sure, and this is how you should interpret this text. When in reality, it doesn't really matter what the author intended. There is a school of literary criticism that's based on sort of looking at the author's biography and seeing how that influences the choices that they made in the book. But for the most part, literary criticism is not a very set in stone thing. It's very much like looking at a text through different lenses and seeing what pops out. So there's lots of different ways to analyze something. There's lots of different interpretations. If you ever want to, wander through the literary criticism world, sometimes you'll see in literary magazines, you'll see like people's responses to articles that other scholars have posted. And it's like a YouTube comment section, but it's, couched in kind of literary language. People would be like, I can't believe you interpret this like that, but clearly you need to interpret it like this. And people get really hung up on sort of there's one way to interpret something, and that's not the case at all. It doesn't matter what the author intended. There is no like canon way to interpret a text. There's certain things that sort of are accepted generally, and we'll talk about those later, but if you're looking at literary criticism, there's different angles that you can take, and there's different interpretations you can take, and the only important thing is that you have stuff in the text that will back it up. A really good example is fan fiction. I know this sounds cheesy, but fan fiction proves to me that people do understand how literary criticism works, because what it is it's basically the same thing. You look at a text, like a TV show, say, and let's say you have two characters who the person writing the fan fiction really wants those two characters to be in a relationship. But in the context of the show, those two characters, maybe they barely ever meet, or if they do meet, it's always very professional, and there is no real relationship in the show. Okay, here comes, seriously, she has things to say. And there's no evidence in the show that these two people are a couple. But say the actors have really good chemistry, say there's a lot of kind of knowing looks shared between them, and you can kind of imply a relationship. And so what fan fiction writers will do is they'll take this couple, they'll look for every piece of evidence, every shred, every symbolic moment that could suggest that these two are secretly, pining for each other or are even in a relationship, and they'll craft a new version of the narrative that fits in with the established show, but slightly different to kind of, interpret these two as a couple. And so it's really interesting how they do this, because it has to sort of fit the characters. You don't want to change the characters at all, but there's a way to sort of fit it into the story. So that's what literary analysis is. It's an opinion, but it's an opinion that's supported by evidence from the text. And some people may call it reading too much into it, but in reality, it's just a new way of interacting with a text. Because if a text is good and has depth and complexity, then you can find new layers in it that you wouldn't normally see. If we're going to be really beholden to author intent, certain beloved works of art will suddenly become sort of unsavory. A good example of this is William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. It's considered a comedy. It's a fairly dark comedy, but it's considered a comedy. And the character of Shylock, as originally intended, was a very anti-Semitic stereotype. The character wore exaggerated makeup, prosthetics, all that kind of stuff to look like a very stereotypical Jewish person that's very negative. And in the context of the story, at the end, Shylock is forcibly converted to Christianity. He's forced to give up his religion, and he's punished for what he was trying to do throughout the story. And it's not a great ending. If you just read the text, the ending is very unsettling because of the way that he's treated. The character isn't necessarily a good person, but the character isn't an evil villain either. There's depth there. He's very gray, and he's still he's still worthy of respect if you look at it from kind of our perspective today. Now, in the 1800s, that's when actors started portraying Shylock as more sympathetic. He wasn't portrayed as kind of an anti-Semitic stereotype. He was portrayed more as a real person, and they didn't need to change anything in the play. They just changed the way that he was presented. And that gives the ending a little bit more of a bittersweet feeling, because everyone's fine, and yes, he is being punished for what he was intending, but having a Jewish person being hauled away in chains and forcibly told he can't ever connect with anything from his culture again, and he has to forcibly convert to Christianity, it adds a kind of dark grimness to his fate, where it's sort of yeah, he deserved to be punished, but did he deserve that, kind of thing. And it makes it a more nuanced play. They didn't have to change anything, but because of that, The Merchant of Venice is now fairly widely performed, and it's much more interesting as a play. If we just looked at sort of author intent, the original version of it, it wasn't great. And I know, we have to look at things in the context of their own time, but the story that's being told is a very dated one, and it does not age very well, and it also lacks nuance. And so the version that we have now, which doesn't change any of the text, it's just the way that everyone is acted and portrayed, now the story is a deeper, more interesting story, because we've moved away from what the author intended. Now that's sort of an example of literary criticism that's kind of become, established. If you talk to people today, most scholars will agree that Shylock is a complex character. He's not pure evil. He's not a mustache-twirling villain. So, that's definitely something, that's definitely something to be aware of. So literary criticism is all about taking something, looking at it in new ways and saying, does this work? It's almost like you're putting on little outfits on the book and you're saying, if we look at it this way, does the story still work? And if it doesn't, then, maybe that's not a great way to look at it. But there are times when different ways of looking at things reveal different layers within the text, and that makes it more interesting to connect with. So, okay, I'm going to get into some actual examples here. Steal this from the cat. So, in grad school, I read Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, which it's set during the American Civil War. It's very grim and violent. It doesn't glorify the Civil War in any way. It's very much focused on like the horrors of war and the meaninglessness of it. And it's really great. It's a wonderful book. And I was fairly close to the end of my grad school years, and I was sort of just willing to take more chances, I guess. And so I did an analysis of this, looking at it as if it was a zombie novel. And, you go through it, and it does kind of work that way. So it has kind of an apocalyptic feel. It's very much looking at how do we survive in this horrible landscape where things are just violent forever. The main character has a number of moments where he imagines that the dead have come back to life and are sort of shuffling towards him. Now, in the context of the book, that's just meant to be just him reacting to the horrors of what he's seeing. But if you look at it as if it was a zombie novel, you find kind of a layer of interest that you wouldn't normally see. This isn't just looking at the Civil War as a great tragedy. It's looking at it as an apocalypse, an end of a kind of way of life for a lot of people, and it was the whole world sort of collapsed, and it's a way to look at it. Now, I would never tell anyone else this is how you should analyze it. I don't want people to say this is for sure a zombie novel and this is how you need to read it. That was just a reading that I did, and it fit, and other people can look at it and they can see different things. You can look at things like how gender is portrayed in this. You can look at how the politics are portrayed. You can even look at, you could do like a Marxist reading of it and look at how class differences play into the story. There's lots of different ways you can look at it because it's a deep enough story that when you look at it through different lenses, you pick out different elements of the story. And it's just a way of engaging with the story in new ways. It's kind of pulling and stretching the story in different directions to see how the narrative reacts to it, basically. So it's not just I'm reading too far into this because I want everyone to think this is what it is. It's more I'm going to look at it this way because it seems to fit and I want to know how that works. And if you take the thing and you put it in, within the framework that you're looking at, and then you see how it matches up. And if enough stuff matches up, then you can say, okay, so we found a new way to look at this. And that's all literary criticism is. It's all opinion, but it's based on evidence from the text, but it shouldn't be something that's like, this is the only way to look at it, or this is what it means, because there is no like canon meaning, really. I think when teachers teach literary criticism, especially in high school, the way they need to word it is, what's a way that this could be looked at, or what could this symbolize? It like they shouldn't say it as like, this is for sure what this symbolizes. It should be more like, what are some different ways you could interpret it? What could this mean? You as a reader approaching this book now, what could this mean to you personally? I don't want them to set it up as something definite and absolute. There is some symbolism that is pretty cut and dry. A good example is the color purple. The color purple is kind of an important symbol in the book, and a character talks about what it means and, you know, what it means to them. And so, you know, you can quote that and you can say, you know, this is what the color purple means, you know, according to the text. So there are some times when it's pretty obvious sort of what an accepted interpretation of a symbol is, but then there's others that sort of keep people always guessing. Another really good example of this, there is Herman Melville's Moby Dick. There is an article called In Nomine Diaboli that analyzes Moby Dick through the lens of Freudian psychoanalysis, and it looks at it as sort of, you know, the symbolism of, you know, of ego and superego and id in conflict, and it kind of lays that framework over the story and looks at sort of, you know, what does this book have to say in a kind of a symbolism of a mind at war with itself kind of thing. And it's a great article. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's a fantastic article. Now, this was written way before Freud was talking about that. Melville doesn't know anything about Freud, and so, you know, to say that like this is what he meant it to be about isn't important, because, you know, Melville and Freud are totally separate. But when the author put a Freudian film over it, or like a lens over it, and looked at the story through that, he found that a lot of stuff does kind of connect, and he's able to craft this sort of epic mythology of the story that seems to represent sort of what happens when a mind is sort of trying to come to terms with something. And it's great. It's a really cool interpretation. It's not the only interpretation. It's not, you know, the correct canon interpretation of it. It's just one person who said, you know what, this kind of fits. Let's see how far it goes. And they found that it did fit pretty well. And so, you know, looking at this through a Freudian lens is really cool. And you can learn a lot from it. But it's just one opinion based on text. So if you talk about In Nomine Diaboli among literary critics, they'll talk about it as like, oh yeah, he had some really good ideas, or he had a really cool interpretation of it, or I really liked what he did with this or that. But they won't talk about like that's the correct way to talk about it, because literary criticism is very flowy and amorphous, and, you know, it's not any one perfect specific thing. So there really is no like canon, you know, interpretation of something. If you have a book that has a character who's sad and the curtains are blue, then you could say, you know, the character's sad, the curtains could symbolize his depressive state, maybe, and it doesn't really matter what the author thinks. It's more like, how does this fit into the story, and could it be seen as a symbol? Because if, let's say, we only ever hear the author talk about the blue curtains whenever the character is having a particularly dark moment, then you could say, you know, yeah, the curtains could symbolize his mental state, but it wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't say it for sure symbolizes this and everyone needs to believe this, because, you know, that's not helpful. Literary criticism isn't about reading too much into something, because that always seems where it's saying you have to kind of believe, or you have to read it in this way. And there's different ways you can analyze something. Another really good example from Shakespeare is The Tempest. You can do a post-colonial reading of The Tempest. Post-colonial criticism looks at the relationship between sort of colonizer and colonized, and it centers the colonized story. So it makes it their story and looks at how they react to the situation of being colonized, but it's from their perspective. And so The Tempest, you have characters like Sycorax and Caliban who live on this island, and, you know, they got there first. And then you've got, you know, Prospero, who shows up and takes the island from them, claims it for himself, and subjugates the people who live there. Ariel's another one. He makes Ariel work for him. He makes Caliban work for him as kind of a beast of burden, or a slave. And you can analyze the story that way. Now, I do need to say that this isn't putting a moral judgment on the text. It's not saying The Tempest is bad because it's racist And, that it's not that. It's saying you can look at it through a post-colonial lens, even though post-colonial literature didn't show up until way, 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 way after Shakespeare. That's a 20th century thing. But you can look at it that way, and it's an interesting enough play that if you look at it that way, you can find kind of interesting elements in the way that the characters are depicted. So it's not saying like this is an evil play and it's bad because it's colonialist and evil. It's just saying this is one way you can look at the story and interpret the characters and kind of get something out of it. So again, it's not placing a moral judgment on it. It's just saying this is one way we can look at it. Another good example is Dracula. There's lots of different ways to look at Dracula. One of the kind of accepted analyses about sort of what the theme is sort of, modern technology versus, ancient superstition and, that kind of thing. Because you've got the vampire hunters who use technology and science and learning and education, and they're battling Dracula, who represents kind of the old world and superstition and, the arcane and that kind of stuff. And so it's science versus almost religion in a way. But you can look at other things. You can look at the way women are represented, and you can analyze Dracula and in two ways. You can see that like it represents sort of backwards gender roles, and it's regressive, but you can also look at it and say that it's very progressive, and it shows equality among gender, and it shows like cooperation, and it's really forward thinking. And so it just depends on where you're coming from and what angle you want to take it as. Dracula is a great book. I love it so much. So there's lots of different ways to analyze texts, but you don't want to get hung up on like this is the only way. Literary criticism it's a discussion. It's always a conversation. It's like, this is how I could read this, and someone else would say, that's really interesting. I kind of can read it this way, and this is what I like to focus on. And there's lots of different ways you can focus on something. I did one paper where I just focused on the clothing that all the main characters wore and what that could possibly say about the main characters. And it was really interesting. I was looking at the book Hope Leslie, which is sort of, early American historical fiction, conflict between like the Native Americans and the settlers kind of thing. And there's some really great stuff that you can find when you look at how people are dressed, how they wear their hair, what it says about their character. If you focus in on that super specific thing, you can learn about a lot about the character. So don't get hung up on literary criticism as being like, this is the way it should be read. If you're looking at Hamlet, you can ask the question, is he crazy? Is he just pretending to be crazy? And you'll get a bunch of different answers because there's different ways to look at it. If you're looking at the Odyssey, at the end, there's people who say that like you could argue that Penelope recognized Odysseus right away, even though he was disguised, and did everything that she did to make sure that he was able to kind of defeat the suitors and come back. There's other people that say, no, she didn't recognize him, and everything that she did was just her own plan, and he kind of accidentally stumbled into it and was able to survive, and then they were reunited. So there's different ways you can look at things. There's no one perfect explanation, but with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading, and don't get into any fights online about literary interpretations, even if it's about a movie or a TV series. Just be nice to each other. All right, see ya. Bye-bye.